Hey guys, this is Poohead199, and today we're going to be talking about swords. More specifically, we are going to look at why we are so enamored with swords in popular culture, in our history, and particularly in our legends, and we will do so through historical contexts. We will mostly be looking at the Western world for this video, but I will bring in a few Eastern world anecdotes probably. Now, I think it's safe to say that swords have been used throughout most of human history, at least written history. In fact, it's very likely that only a handful of weapons or even tools have been used longer. The knife is the oldest sophisticated or crafted weapon in existence, as found in the Oldowan tools, named so because they were first found by British African archaeologists in Tanzania, followed closely by the spear and the axe. However, once our ancestors developed metallurgy, we swiftly developed the sword. Now, the most common military weapon used throughout antiquity and the medieval era, all the way to the early modern period, was the spear, along with various other polearms. The reasons are quite simple. Spears are cheap, easy to make, require very little, if any, metal, and have a massive advantage in reach. An unarmored man with a 9-foot spear, fighting an unarmored man with a 3-foot sword or axe, will win 8 times out of 10 due to the reach advantage. But if this is the case, then why make the sword? What makes the sword special? Well, there's many answers to that question, but likely the most prevalent is its compatibility and its versatility. A spear cannot be worn. You have to carry it everywhere. That's why people tended to never use it for self-defense or even home defense. A spear cannot be saddled onto a horse without a special device, and a spear cannot be used in a variety of circumstances. Fighting indoors, for instance, would be very hard for a spear. Swinging it is also difficult and is not very effective. And we also need to think about armor and shields. Both sets of protective gear change the game. A man in plate armor or wearing a kite shield with a sword can close the distance on the man with the spear and fundamentally change the effectiveness of the spear, even if the man with the spear also has armor. And we also need to note that spears, along with axes and maces, are fairly particular in their definition. Of course, there are plenty of variations, but the sword is likely the most ubiquitous in design. Something as large as the 6-foot Zweihander is a sword, all the way down to the Roman gladius, which is barely a fourth of its size and with a vastly different shape in both blade and hilt. But both are swords. And it seems like every culture with swords instinctively or culturally understood that fact to one degree or another. However, the sword is also extremely versatile in its usage. And more importantly, and this is where we're getting into the topic, swords became a status symbol. Despite the fact that in many military contexts the sword was a backup weapon, it became synonymous with wealth, power, and influence. And that is because of its make. Firstly, the sword is the only weapon before guns that had no use other than warfare. Now, obviously guns are used in hunting, various things, but you know what I mean. You could make a knife to do a dozen different things. An axe was great at chopping lumber. Spears and bows were used for hunting, but the sword was purely a weapon. Yes, there were some small instances of hunting swords, but those were more curiosities than anything. A sword was made specifically to kill another human being. And so it was not very cost-effective to make a sword, right? You see, before the late medieval era, good metal, whether it be copper or bronze or iron or steel, was difficult to come by in comparison to stone and timber and other materials. And so, if one made a sword, which takes far more metal than an axe or a spear or even a mace, that meant that if someone had a sword, the person could afford to make such a weapon, or that a person was important enough to be granted such a weapon. It was a weapon that had no other use. Now, as antiquity moved on, metal became more and more available, and so we started seeing bronze shields and even types of plate armor on the Greek phalanx or the Roman lamellar armor, and swords became more readily available. And that might also be one reason why the Romans switched from the gladius to the spatha, other than various political reasons. There was probably more iron available, so they didn't need to have swords that were so short anymore. But anyway, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Western world was set back, and both good quality iron along with smiths that could forge them were in short supply. And yet again, the sword became a symbol of status and wealth. Legends like Beowulf made swords into magical weapons because they were so hard to attain unless you were a chieftain or a lord. The Anglo-Saxon and the Germanic peoples had what was called ring swords, which was the epitome of that ideal. They were spatha-like swords with a golden or bronze ring around the hilt, which symbolized they had made oaths to a great king, and it was sort of a gift to a mighty warrior. In fact, rings are a pretty big deal in Germanic myth, as Anglo-Saxon kings and chiefs were sometimes called ring lords, as they gave these swords along with special rings to their vassals. And you wonder where Tolkien got a few of his ideas, of course. Anyway, the idea of swords as a status symbol led to a number of Germanic and Celtic myths making swords into legendary weapons, like Hrunting and Beowulf, or Excalibur from King Arthur, or Sigurd's sword Gram, or Cleve Solas of Celtic Tales, which means sword of light or even lightsaber, according to some translations, which I think is kind of funny, or Durendal, which is the sword of Roland from the Song of Roland, and these myths stuck around. Now, these myths lasted through the Viking Age, as did the scarcity of good quality swords. Germany, or at least where modern-day Germany is, was the largest exporter of swords, but that was still not a huge collection. When spears weren't used, the axe was the main weapon, usually when it came to Northern Europe and Vikings, generally accompanied by the shield, though the two-handed Dane axe did see its time in the sun during the era of chainmail. However, once Europe had advanced to the late medieval era, good steel and how to shape it became far more widely available. In fact, a good anecdote is during the 100 Years' War, a normal soldier's, or I think a longbowman's income was, in the English army, was 6 pence a day. And with that, you could buy a good quality sword. So really, with a day's wages, you could just get a sword. It wasn't really that difficult at that time. I also should note or mention that the Middle East reached this point a few centuries before Europe. They never really lacked for good metals or the smiths to use them like much of the West did, and the Islamic Golden Age was arguably the height of civilization during the early medieval era. However, during the 14th to 16th centuries, the entire world of swords shifted. Swords went from being a military weapon to a weapon carried by every martial man, like I was talking about with the English longbowmen. Infantrymen used them as backup weapons, or sometimes even as main armaments, as did knights in full plate. Men carried them for self-defense, settled conflicts of honor and duels with them. Specific laws were made for swords on who was allowed to carry them or where, and while they were still a symbol, it became more of a fashion symbol than a status symbol. Some sword designs were considered out of date. Others were new or strange, and the more elaborate the design or the more expensive precious metals used on it, the more important you seemed in social circles. Not only that, but other than soldiers and town guards, swords were used mostly by travelers, like merchants, mercenaries, and yes, adventurers. Men who weaved tall tales of the Orient or Africa. Despite its widespread popularity, it never lost its spark of intrigue. A man, or even woman in certain instances, could carve a name for themselves with a good sword. And unlike the spear or the axe, due to the versatility of the weapon, swords were used far into the age of gunpowder, and with good results, surprisingly enough. Now, one could make the argument that the musket and bayonet became a sort of spear, and it was effective for its own ease of use. However, sabers and rapiers and even varying degrees of longswords were still rather popular, and efficient at what they did. During the War of the Three Kingdoms, which are the wars in the British Isles during the 18th century, not the wars in China during the 4th century BC, I don't want to mix those up, the Highland broadsword or claymore and the targe proved to be extremely effective against English regulars on the field and embarrassed them multiple times. You see, what they did was that the Scots and even the Irish sometimes charged the English line to close distance, the Englishmen in standard musket formation, and after the English fired a volley, they needed to reload, which they did not have the time to, or they fixed bayonets. And the targe was good for two things. One, it covered a man so it made it harder to aim at him, and two, you could shove a targe into a bayonet point, which made the point useless to stab, and locked it in, and then the Scotsmen would use their big sword to cut the Englishmen down. And since it was such close quarters, the English suffered massive casualties compared to the Highlanders, which had been hit by one, maybe two volleys. Hell, even until World War I, there were Navy cutlasses on steel destroyers to repel boarders, and swords saw big use in the trenches. In fact, I remember, I think it was 1912, General Patton, when he was a young man, had his own style of sword and practiced with it because he knew very well that it was about to be used in real warfare. And then, of course, during the Napoleonic Wars, cuirassiers in full plate and wielding sabers scared the hell out of ground troops and were actually very effective at breaking lines and cutting men down. And even as time went by and guns became more effective and readily available, swords still were a status symbol. If you wore a sword on the battlefield, that distinguished you as an officer and perhaps even a gentleman. And even today, during marches, officers wear swords. Swords are the premier dueling weapon, the weapon of status, and for multiple centuries, as I said, the weapon of explorers and adventurers. It's somewhat odd to note that these weapons were both very rare and very common in various eras, and both aided in their infamy in the human psyche. And so the myths, legends, and the real history around them, as well as their ease of use in both combat and logistics, coalesced into this sort of pinnacle of human heroism and note to make the sword the most popular weapon in popular culture. Okay, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you liked it, please like and share, and subscribe if you think it's worth it. Alright, everyone, thanks.